Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you very, very much for joining us, hosted by ILG and SimplyVAT. Today's webinar is going to be a practical guide for Canadian brands expanding into the UK and EU markets. One housekeeping rule before we start today. Any questions, and please, we do encourage questions. Pop them on the comments and we'll get round to them at the end of today's webinar. Moving through, we'll do a couple of introductions. It's a pleasure to meet you all. My name is Danny Ellard and I'm the UK Sales Manager here at ILG. A brief introduction to ILG. We were founded in 1990, so 35 years old, and we exist to remove friction in operations for growth-focused businesses in e-commerce and retail, providing the appropriate balance of people, product, and processes to provide fulfillment services that enable brands to scale without any operational constraints. ILG as a business is 80 million in global turnover with 13 facilities across the UK and Europe, and a total order volume shipped per year of around 8 million orders. So a fair size and scaling as much as possible. I am joined today by Payne from SimplyVAT. Liam, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Of course, thank you, Danny. Well, my name's Liam, obviously, as Danny mentioned. I am from the Business Development and Partnerships team over at SimplyVAT. So just to give a bit of background on SimplyVAT, we deal with international kind of businesses growing cross-border, specialise in kind of e-commerce brands and growth as well. We've been about, not as long as you have, but we've been about for about 11 years now, I believe, coming up to our 12th year. Really building on that kind of e-commerce and wholesale brands, helping them to grow into the EU and UK markets.
Wonderful. Thanks, Liam. If we move through to the next slide, we will start with why the UK and EU and why now. I think it's no surprise to anyone that there has been a great level of uncertainty around global trade with all of the dreaded T words in both Trump and tariffs, limiting global trade. And with that uncertainty and with the cost of living crisis, consumer volumes down and everything that comes with it, quite often brands from Canada and other regions, we see it in the UK, we see it globally, are looking for new markets to access to drive new customers. And the UK in itself is the third largest e-commerce market after the US and China, totaling 340 billion in terms of e-commerce volume. And when we look at the relationship between Canada and the UK, it has far smoother customs and lower duties than other nations, given the trade agreements that exist between the two countries. For Canadian brands, there's a huge chance to diversify away from North America. The US has always been such a large market for them, but given the fact that there are these restrictions in trade now, it's time to diversify. And the UK and Canada have a trade agreement which is heavily reflected on the former trade agreement from the EU and Canada, but enables a level of free trade between the UK and Canada to really drive that market for them. However, there is a large expectation with UK consumers around delivery expectations, delivery standards, the transparency within pricing and everything else that comes with that limits the ability to serve the UK from the Canadian market. Now, if we push through to the next slide, we will see.
Sorry, just before we do, I have a quick question for you, Danny, because I think this is really interesting. So when you're looking at obviously that e-commerce market, how large it is, typically you might be going into this, I might be jumping a bit ahead, but when you look at kind of client type, is there a specific kind of product area that you see kind of growing bigger than others, working in the fulfillment industry? Are you seeing more like beauty brands? Are you seeing more like homeware brands or anything like that, really?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, ILG work primarily in a space that supports three key verticals for us. And those three key verticals are beauty, wellness, and fashion. And we, over the 35 years that we've existed, have built a client base that is a wash of brands within that portfolio. And that, of course, draws a significant amount of interest from brands within that vertical. However, it doesn't and isn't limited to that. I think when you look at global trade, certainly from markets geographically that are as far away from one another as Canada and the UK, it certainly supports an e-commerce market. Smaller products, shipping costs are therefore lower. When you get into the real nuts and bolts of the carrier landscape, there is the payoff between actual weight and volumetric weight, which means lightweight, heavy products take an impact on shipping costs purely because of the size. And within that, then, if you've got larger margin products that you're looking to sell, it doesn't necessarily favour those. The interesting piece around the landscape that we primarily work in of beauty, wellness, fashion, typically the products are low in size, they're light in weight, they're high in value, and the margins that the brands have within the product can therefore justify the shipping costs and the increase in spend that comes with those markets. There's trends within those markets, such as the lipstick effect within beauty, that suggests they're recession proof, and they just continue to grow. We've seen those markets outgrow a lot of others in terms of verticals that we do support. And COVID, the online spending habits that it created, we are creatures of habit. People are now more used to spending online, has definitely driven a new normal within those verticals in terms of increased volumes. So yeah, absolutely, those would be the typical verticals that we would support there, Liam.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, funny enough, that's kind of what we see as well. Like a lot more like brands with smaller products, like beauty brands or homeware brands that typically do have maybe thinner, light homeware items like decor. They tend to be the ones that grow quickly. So it's great that there's a bit of a crossover there. But yeah, I'll let you get on.
Thank you very, very much, Liam. So moving through to the next slide, there's two ways to unpack how the UK market and the Canadian market, and then the Canadian market and the EU market can trade with one another. And as a brand that is based in Canada, there's two potential ways of doing this. There's a far softer way, and then there's a harder full launch way. And the UK-Canada Trade Continuity Agreement, like I say, reduces those barriers to entry when shipping from Canada to the UK market. That enables customers to have a level of transparency within duties, within taxes. And it is a far softer launch to service the UK market. Perhaps it comes with an element of marketing spend, but it reduces the requirement for a warehouse. It reduces a requirement to hold stock in the location. But what it does do is delay transit times to customers, and increases the cost to customers. So why does it make more sense to physically be here? If we flick through to the next slide, it makes more sense to physically be here to satisfy the demands of the UK customer. Now, the difference between the UK and Canadian market, albeit they're very similar sizes in terms of population and demand and propensity to spend, the geography of the UK is far smaller than that of Canada. So carrier networks are far more mature. Customers expect a far higher level of service. They expect faster delivery, and they expect transparent pricing when it comes to the checkout element of the relationship between Canadian brands in the UK. So if they see a product online and it costs X amount, but they get to checkout and they see significant shipping costs and they see duties and taxes that are applied to those products, there will be a higher level of basket abandonment. The conversion rates will be lower because of the propensity of UK customers to expect shorter delivery times and lower costs within that. Now, what is very interesting is I've recently run this study for a Canadian brand in terms of looking at the full landed cost of shipping from Canada to the UK. And what we were able to identify for that brand was reducing the delivery lead times from 8 days to 3 days, and reducing delivery costs, given the fact that they were sending through express courier networks from $27 down to around $6, which is a massive saving for the brand. It increases the margin that the brand has in the product. It's a far better customer experience, and the all-round solution just created a win-win environment for the brand and the customers. What the UK can also be is a gateway into Europe. So the relationship between carrier networks within the UK and Europe are far stronger. You have the ability to access both express and road carrier networks to continue to drive down the costs. You have the ability to clear in country or clear via customs hubs through the IOSS solution, which is certainly Liam's area of expertise, and I'll leave that for him to comment on a touch later. But it is also a gateway into the European market. So the important thing is to understand what the customer demands are and how you can satisfy those to drive conversion, increase the appetite for the customer to come back, as retention is so important in this customer journey now. If we push through to the next slide. And it's all about omni-channel. So again, if a brand decides that the route into the UK market is to split stock, is to open a fulfillment center in the UK or Europe, they then need to think about what customers are they actually trying to access. So be it direct to consumer, your e-commerce customers, or a retail element, there's two different ways of managing both of those. And finding a partner that can support both of those routes to market is very, very important, because what it takes from an operational perspective and from a relationship perspective differs heavily. We've covered D2C, but when you look at the B2B retail market within the UK, whether that is your own stores, whether that is distribution centers, whether that's retailers or retailers, they will all have a different set of finite requirements that are needed to be achieved to satisfy what is their vendor manuals and to avoid non-compliance, which comes at a significant cost. Now, if you're looking to service retailers from Canada, you have to factor in customs clearance, you have to factor in the ability to achieve time delivery slots, which is a hugely important element of the retailer's vendor manuals, versus the ability to import from your Canadian warehouse to your UK warehouse in bulk at cost value, clear from brand to brand, and then send via a road network, via an overnight freight network, via same-day delivery to satisfy the retailer time delivery slots. And that is a huge route to market that we've seen for North American businesses coming across that don't necessarily want to get into the dogfight of the e-commerce world, bidding for new customers. The customer acquisition cost is so high now from an e-com perspective that very often the feedback that we're hearing from brands is the first order actually loses money. And it's all about the retention piece. Now, with retailers, what you get is proven footfall. You're leveraging off the back of the retailers, the customer base that they've already experienced, and you're getting your brand in front of customers that can walk into a store, see your product, try your product, love your product, and buy your product. And what typically works for brands then is the B2B acquires the customer, and then the experience that you give them from a retail perspective will drive the volume then onto your direct-to-consumer site for repurchasing, customer loyalty, customer commitment, and then that ongoing journey that the customers therefore receive. I'm going to push forward to the next slide now and just summarize how it is that you can look to scale with a fulfillment provider within region without the headaches. Now, ILG a number of times and with a number of examples have helped these businesses with the support of SimplyVAT from a VAT perspective to launch in region, fulfill and grow. It takes a provider that can truly understand your business, truly understand the culture of your business, and truly understand the experience that you're trying to provide your customers to reflect what you're doing in your country across to the UK or Europe. So that's a massively important piece. And what ILG also brings to the table, certainly for those brands within the verticals that we formerly mentioned, is a huge level of experience in what it takes to be successful, what it takes to scale, what it takes to scale sustainably, for the longevity of a partnership. Because once someone moves fulfillment provider once, they most certainly don't want to do it twice. And the relationships that we've had over the 35 years, the brands that have grown at an exponential scale, Malin and Goetz is a perfect example, have tried and tested our product, fractured our product at times even. It's never a perfect world, the world that we're living in. And through that experience, we've been able to bolt on and enhance our product, develop our offerings, improve the technology within our fulfillment centers to continue to scale with these brands as they go from stage to stage. It offers end-to-end support. So from the freight pickup, from the warehouse in Canada to the UK, through to the pick and pack, the storage accuracy, batch control, shipping, returns handling, it gives you that end-to-end peace of mind that operating in a separate region on a different time zone at times, which can be a challenge, to have your trust and faith in a provider that can manage all of that for you without the headaches is really, really important. Now, there's ways in which we make that easier. We integrate entirely into a number of web stores, ERPs, be it Shopify, the NetSuites, the SAP of the world, to give real-time data transfer to brands to make sure that their system reflects ours, but equally having an element of self-serve within our portal gives customers that right to access any element of data that we have, to see stock in real time, to see orders in real time, to see how we're performing from a KPI perspective, to know that they are putting that trust in the right provider. And then to summarize, the speciality in premium beauty, wellness, fashion, and lifestyle brands, from a e-commerce and a retail approach across those two regions, to have one provider, one point of call, one system, one invoicing run, one integration across two regions to manage an omni-channel fulfillment approach is really, really important for that relationship piece. Moving through, I will hand over to the lovely Liam to tell you a little bit more about VAT.
Thank you, Danny. Okay, yeah, well, that was really insightful. And if we look at kind of the VAT side, I think there's going to be a lot of different crossovers for us. So obviously the first thing we need to look at is, what do I need to become kind of market ready? If we're looking at kind of different areas, so the first thing we need to do is look at that flow of goods within the desired countries, for the expansion, where your stock will be held, where the goods are going to be going from and to. So that would be kind of a key element, I believe, for that. And then when we look at the other aspects, obtaining any relevant VAT registrations for stock movements, I'll go into these a bit deeper in a second, so don't worry if it just make any sense. And then obviously obtaining that 3PL warehouse for fulfillment, which obviously is where ILG and yourself, Danny, would come in. And then looking at also additionally any product compliance needs. Within the EU, UK, obviously these are going to be especially triggered and required for those beauty brands, anyone with like supplements, ingredients, all that kind of stuff listed. Looking forward into kind of the main triggers for a VAT registration, I know this is quite a hefty slide, so don't worry everyone, I'm not going to read fully off of it, but the main kind of areas that trigger a VAT need are holding of the stock, any DDP supplies to UK or EU customers from an outside of EU, UK or EU location. So, for example, that Canadian warehouse, if you ship it with VAT collected, so delivery duty paid shipments, that would trigger a need for either an IOS, which I'll go into shortly, or kind of a local VAT reg, depending on the countries. And then looking more at that wholesale supplies, looking at that kind of, if they act as the importer of record on those moving forward also. So that would be key for any, wholesale activities that may happen if you've got a mixture of suppliers of B2C and B2B. So the main key thing, I'm going to break it down into two separate areas. So we're going to be looking at kind of, I guess, UK first, then migrate over across to the EU, just because obviously since Brexit, there has been a few different rules that have now been put in place for the UK sales. So as of the 1st of January 2021, the UK obviously is no longer an EU member state, so UK VAT rules prevail here. With kind of looking at Amazon or holding stock 3PL, they require a UK VAT registration from the offset. There's no local threshold applicable for any kind of, non-resident businesses anywhere. So not just the UK, that's applicable also in the EU. There's obviously a hard border. So if you're holding stock in the UK, moving it across to the EU, I know obviously ILG have the Polish warehouse. We would be looking at, re-import duties. There might be like additional import VAT. Duties are settled depending on how the goods are shipped and where they're manufactured. But obviously, Danny might know a little bit more about the duty side than I do. But when it comes to, the UK, it's more so looking at those pieces, looking at the flow of goods, and most importantly, if you are going for that traditional flow of, Canada to a UK customer, if the goods are below £135, then you would trigger a need for a VAT registration. That's the kind of key rule that really popped into place upon, Brexit happening. And I would say it's quite a key element that a lot of people may not kind of realize, especially if the brands, are beauty. I know, for example, a lot of the goods do tend to be below kind of £135. So if it's a one consignment order, you probably will trigger a need for a UK VAT number. And then if we flip over to the EU, as kind of similar to the UK, obviously it's going to be commercial goods that are subject to import procedures. So once the goods are cleared for free circulation, that's kind of when you clear them at that initial border. For example, if you utilize kind of Polish warehouse, you'd be kind of settling the import VAT at Poland, and then you're free to circulate, whether that's B2B, B2C. You don't need to kind of worry about that, although there is an additional registration that I'll touch on very, very soon. And then when you kind of look at it, it's the same rules as, importer of record that's liable. So anyone who's covering that VAT, yourself, your end customer, the end business, you will be required to, register for VAT or collect it. It depends on the flow, depends on your agreements with those kind of customers and clients also. We've mentioned the iOS a few times. Obviously, I know Danny kind of briefly touched on it, and I've mentioned it a few times now as well. The iOS, I would say, and I don't know whether obviously Danny you'd agree, but I think it's a great testing point for kind of brands that are looking to grow into the markets. So when we look at it, it is optional. So you don't require, uh, you know, VAT number at all to sell to the EU, as long as you're not collecting VAT on those supplies. So it needs to be under a delivered at place Incoterm, or, a shipment that is handled by a third party, or however that kind of is handled. But as long as you're not collecting VAT at checkout, then you don't need a registration anyway. However, when we look at iOS, and what we typically see with a lot of our brands that tend to be under the Import One Stop Shop scheme, is growth, because it removes kind of barriers for end customers. It allows you to test those local markets without, going all in. You don't require kind of 27 registrations. It's literally one registration, one return, one payment to the tax office. So it's very much, done all in one go. You don't need to worry about sitting there clicking through 27 VAT returns and saying, yep, all good, ready to go. It's literally done in less than 5 minutes typically. So it's quite a good scheme, especially for, I don't want to say smaller sellers, to be fair, because we see a lot of brands grow smaller, larger. whether they were doing activity pre-Brexit, post-Brexit, anything like that, especially for Canadian sellers recently, we're seeing a lot more kind of activity going into the EU. So it doesn't matter what size your brand is. I would just say it's quite a good scheme to really jump in on and get going.
Yeah, I think just a comment on that, Liam.
Hmm.
It's something that we've massively seen as an enabler post Brexit. Obviously, pre Brexit, you had the agreement to be able to access that market very easily, frictionless almost, which wasn't the case post Brexit. But the iOS scheme has definitely been an enabler for brands to test that market for sure. We've seen it at a top level across a number of different clients. Um, to remove that initial level of friction, give that customer the best experience possible, to almost be that springboard back into the region, which was almost cut off at the nose post Brexit. So yeah, just to support that point.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree as well. I mean, when we look at it in a sense that going both post Brexit, I think it just enables you to look at I like to look at it as analytical because I'm a numbers person. Surprise, surprise, I'm in VAT. So I like numbers. And when you look at kind of the VAT return, you can really break down kind of what markets might be stronger, what markets may be, less. It improves end customer experience, as you've kind of highlighted as well. Like, just really enables you to grow in that market. And it's also one benefit I would say is typically under the iOS, it's quite quick. So it typically takes no longer than, a week or so to really come back approved from the tax offices. We've seen it come through a lot quicker than that, 24 hours sometimes. So really good for kind of quick growth, especially for brands that, because obviously I know we're in July, so probably, not everyone's favorite word at the moment, but as ecom, in the ecom industry, we know that we need to start preparing for peak. So if you're looking at kind of, the festive gifting season and you kind of forget about getting those local registrations or you're not sure, IELTS could be a really great benefit, especially if you're wanting to grow those brands quite quickly. Because you can literally wake up on November 1st and register for it, and it might land by November 3rd, depending on how quick it kind of proceeds through. The other thing that we'll just like touch on, it's just a couple of slides really left, is the opposite, obviously holding that inventory locally. So as we've highlighted, that triggers a need for you to obtain a VAT number. Obviously, if you utilize ILG services, that would need to be kind of the Polish VAT number, and you'd need to, get that registered before you're able to get the goods landed. And you'll also need the Polish EORI number for that. The other thing as well is something called the one-stop shop, which is a union one-stop shop. So the union one-stop shop, similar to the one-stop shop with the iOS, but instead of the goods being outside the EU at the point of sale, it's inside the EU at point of checkout. So you're able to really utilize it no matter kind of you know, what the value of the goods are, as long as they're inside the EU, you can get it registered and it's validated against your Polish VAT number. And yeah, that is kind of everything wrapped up from my side when it comes to the VAT. Oh, no, I'm wrong. We're looking at a case study. So obviously, I just wanted to highlight, I guess we've kind of touched on it, but when it comes to looking at it in practicalities, if a Canadian business is going to be holding stock, in both ILG's UK Polish fulfillment center for direct to consumer sales, you know, how quickly can you get that ready? Do I need? So looking at it, obviously, as mentioned, you need that both VAT numbers. UK does take around 8 to 12 weeks, so might need a little bit more forward planning than kind of Poland. Poland is a great kind of growth aspect with 2 to 3 weeks for it to take for you to get the VAT number. So you need to get those aligned and any applicable EORI numbers. The additional scope in Poland for Canadian businesses is there is a requirement for fiscal representative to be appointed. They basically become jointly liable for collecting and remitting the VAT. If that's of any interest, obviously someone to get the Polish VAT number, you can get in touch with us and we'll go through the exact kind of what that needs look like first. And then obviously we'll be able to kind of go through in more detail. But then on the flip side, you'll also need that OSS return. Once you've got those kind of main things, you're good to go. And Danny will be able to kind of support you in getting the kind of growth ready on the fulfillment side. And now, that was me done.
Yeah, thanks for that, Liam. I think what is really interesting, and one point that you and I have done this together on, so it is a real life case study that we can talk about. But one thing that's really interesting is the parallel between setting up with a warehouse and the integration requirements there and the timelines that it needs, and setting up the VAT in region to be able to trade. Now, we've seen it from both ends in the UK, acquiring the UK EORI VAT number. We've seen it in Poland as well, acquiring the Polish VAT and EORI. And it's almost a direct parallel, and correct me if you disagree, Liam, but a direct parallel in terms of how long it takes to acquire the VAT number and how long it takes to integrate a warehouse, which typically lies between, depending on the region, but certainly with the warehouse perspective, 8 to 12 weeks from start to finish, and how you can run those in parallel. And the first point of stock importation from a warehouse perspective, you'll need to have the VAT and EORI in place to clear the goods. But the actual setup of both can run side by side to streamline this process as much as possible. I don't know if you've got any comments on that, Liam, but it's interesting how we've seen that before.
Yeah, I would agree to a point. Obviously, when it comes to Poland, it is a little bit quicker, but there is additional kind of growth scopes that you need. So you'll need, obviously, one to make the goods kind of land. In order for you to also obtain a reg anywhere, you need a contractual agreement with that fulfillment center. So obviously, when we've worked together, obviously any clients that come across from yourself would need that ILG kind of contract in place as evidence to support the requirement for that number. We find, especially HMRC, can be a little bit strict when it comes to lack of support. So we need to make sure that we've got enough evidence to really, minimize any kind of pushbacks on the registration or anything like that. That's what would obviously bring it a lot higher. Obviously, UK is 8 to 12 weeks anyway, but Poland, we're looking at it more like 2 to 3 weeks, but you do need kind of translation documents. OSS also takes 2 to 3 weeks. So they definitely run in parallel. And you can even start like the onboarding with ILG prior, because you'll need that contract ready for us to get that submitted.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, from our side, we've said it, we'll vouch for it in terms of our expertise in beauty, wellness, and fashion. We've got a host of case studies that I would urge you to go and have a look at. All of these brands are from different regions. We support them in different geographies through different levels of the e-commerce retail omni-channel scale. So I'd urge you to go and have a look through and have a read of some of our case studies to see what we've done for some of our wonderful clients. I think that pulls us through to a final Q&A. If anyone has any questions, please do pop them in the chat. But we, having done this before, Liam, have a set of examples of questions that we quite often see come through, certainly from our side, and with us being warehouse experts but not VAT experts, we often pass a lot of people in the direction of Liam to share his wisdom, share his expertise and knowledge on this topic. So Liam, I've got a few questions that I'll fire at you if you're happy to take those. Wonderful.
Of course.
Wonderful. Now, one question that we often see come through is, what is the threshold for Canadian businesses needing to register for VAT in the UK or EU, and how long does this typically take?
So we briefly kind of touched up on this one, but I think if you're selling with VAT being collected, no threshold at all from that first taxable supply. If you're obviously shipping to the UK, goods below £135, you need that VAT reg. If everything's above, you might not need it. For the EU as well, if you're not collecting VAT, then you don't need one. But obviously, you can utilize IOS as like a short-term solution or anything like that. But on the ground, local regs, no threshold if you're collecting VAT. Timeframes, as we've discussed as well, takes a very variable amount of time and it is based on kind of support. So I would say lowest is Poland at 2 to 3 weeks. Highest we see is kind of Germany, France, UK, both all sitting around 8 to 12 weeks typically depending on kind of, the region, the requirements, all that kind of stuff.
Wonderful. And again, I think we've probably covered off parts of this, but a direct answer to a direct question from you, Liam. Do I need a separate VAT number for each EU country that I plan to sell to?
Yes, if you're shipping goods straight across. No, if you're holding stock directly in one member state, such as Poland, because you can use an OSS. So not as direct, but a bit more of a roundabout.
And then, given the fact that we've spoken about an omni-channel approach an awful lot, and looking at e-commerce and B2B, does the OSS scheme cover B2B transactions or only D2C?
So the OSS only enables you for that B2C collection. It doesn't enable any kind of B2B sales to be remitted on there. They're treated slightly differently. So when the goods are landed locally, they become intra-community kind of supplies and acquisitions. So still free for circulation, just treated on a different kind of format.
Wonderful. And I think that will conclude it, I guess, unless there's anything else from your side, Liam.
No, I mean, I think what would be a good guess to really tie up, just one question from us would be, when it comes to the clients who are growing and who might be watching this and are interested in really getting forward, if they want to say, I'm going to revisit the topic, sorry, I'm mentioning it again, Christmas. If they want to get ready for then, when do they need to get in touch with you? Because for us, I would say that it needs to be kind of now, depending on what registration they need. But what about you?
Yeah, most certainly. And I think, look, with the uncertainty that there is with the US, I mean, it was only a few days ago that Trump announced his big, beautiful bill, which would impact both the tariffing situations, but also the de minimis situation, which has been favourable for quite some time. There's no better time to act than now. If you leave it too late, other brands will get ahead. And if you enable them to get ahead, that's your competition. So I think you're absolutely right. There is no better time than now. And from a warehousing and fulfillment perspective, of course, there is that period towards the end of the year. It's used to start at the end of November. It now starts at the start of November and travels through all the way to January, which is peak. And one thing that is really important and that any good 3PL provider should be doing is over that period making sure that all internal resources focused on navigating that period of increased volume. So from a warehousing perspective, to take a realistic and pragmatic approach, you wouldn't really want to be moving 3PL any later than mid-October. And working backwards logically, taking that 8 to 12 week period that we've alluded to already, you're absolutely right, Liam. Now is the time to strike. It's an opportunity to get ahead of your competitors out there, and it enables enough time to manage that transition smoothly. If you work with someone like SimplyVAT, they will take away all of the headaches of VAT, which causes an awful lot of people an awful lot of headaches, but equally gives you the opportunity to get live, get settled in, work with the 3PL so they truly understand your business, they truly understand your customers, they truly understand what message you're trying to convey to be ready for that peak season. So yeah, couldn't agree more. Now is the time. Wonderful. And I think that brings us to a conclusion. So I would just like to close off by saying thank you to anyone that has tuned in. Liam and I will be open to questions post this if you don't want to pop your question in the comment. So please do get in touch if there's any questions that you have around warehousing, fulfillment, VAT. Certainly Liam is your man. Don't come to me with any VAT questions. Thank you once again for your time, and we hope to hear from you soon.